Thank you for joining me today. Grab a Bible. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. This is another 5 minutes of faith. Here we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, and we're talking about grace, and I pitched the idea that grace is much more than just God's unmerited favor. Now, it certainly includes that. That is a truth, but there's so much more to it, and I really suspect that many Christians just stop right there, and they say, it's God's unmerited favor. Yep, that's good enough. That's all I need to know. And while it's true that we do not merit or have earned God's favor, and He does give us His favor because of His mercy and grace, but grace is so much more than that. There's multi sides to grace. It is multidimensional. And whenever we operate and work in the grace of God, that is God's divine influence upon our heart, and it reflects in our life. There's evidence of it. God's grace, I believe, is the exceeding greatness of His power toward us who believe, according to the working of His mighty power. That's grace. It is enabling you to be what you could never be on your own. It's equipping you to do what you could never do on your own. That is grace. Well, look what it says in 2 Corinthians 6, 1 and 2. We then, as workers together with Him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. I wonder how is it possible to receive the grace of God in vain? Well, I believe it's this. When we begin to trust in our own strength and not His strength, when we begin to trust in our own ability and not His ability, you could be saved. Thank God you got saved by grace. But if you're now trying to perfect your salvation through your works, if you were saved and began in the Spirit, but now you're trying to be made perfect by the flesh, you've now received God's grace in vain. You're no longer trusting in His grace. You're no longer trusting in His power. You're now trusting in your own power. If you're trying to do ministry on your own, if you're trying to live a holy life by simply, I've got to wear certain clothes to be holy, and I've got to go to a certain church to be holy, and I've got to do certain things. I've got to pray for 30 minutes a day, maybe an hour a day, 2 hours a day. I got to read through the Bible every year, and if I don't, then I'm not holy. See, what's happening is you are no longer trusting in God's grace. You're trusting in your strength, and now you have received God's grace in vain. And Paul again warns us not to do this. Do not receive the grace of God in vain. Go to Galatians chapter 2, verse 21. Paul says, I do not set aside the grace of God. Did you know that it is possible for you and I to set it aside, to not depend on it? Yeah. Well, we got to be careful not to do that. Paul says, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. You know, Christ died for you and I to be saved. When we receive that salvation, that's grace. When He changed your life and you simply received it by faith, that is grace. But again, if you're trying to be made perfect, if you're trying to move on past that point by the works of the law, and I got to do all these things, and if I don't, then God's not going to bless me, and God's not going to do things in my life. Well, you're no longer doing it by grace. You're doing it by your strength, and that's in vain. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 through 13, Paul says, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. He learned that by grace. Grace will provide everything I need. Whether I have a lot or have a little, it doesn't matter. God's grace is still the same. He says, for I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry. Now that's interesting. Paul says I've learned to be full. I didn't think that being full was a lesson that I needed to learn. I just thought it was automatic. Hey, I'm full. I feel great. This is wonderful. But Paul says I learned to be full and I learned to be hungry. Well, what he's saying there is I've learned to trust in God the same whether I'm full or whether I'm hungry. I've learned to trust in grace the same whether I have everything I need or whether I have nothing, and I am trusting by faith that God will provide what I need. He goes on in verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. There's grace right there. Christ strengthens us. It is His grace that is His strength. I can do all things. I can have fullness. I can be abased. I can be abound. I can be full. I can be hungry. He goes, I can be abound and I can suffer need. No matter what state I'm in, I'm going to be content because I know God's grace is in abundance toward me. And it's in abundance towards you too. Do you believe it? Amen. I hope you have received and I hope you've been blessed. Thank you for joining me. This has been 5 Minutes of Faith.